Alexander the Great never lost a battle, not one. In 11 years of continuous warfare across 3 continents against the Persian Empire, the greatest power the ancient world had ever produced, he was undefeated. He died at 32, master of a territory stretching from Greece to the borders of India, the largest empire any single man had ever built. He also murdered his closest friend in a drunken rage. He had his most loyal general's son broken into a confession and executed. He imprisoned the historian whose job it was to record his glory and left that man to die in chains. He alienated the army that loved him, adopted the customs of the enemy he had destroyed, and died having named no successor, leaving everything he had conquered to be torn apart by the men who had helped him take it. He left no plan, no heir, and no future. Within a generation, the empire was gone. Both of those men are the same man. The question worth asking, the one that has never been answered to anyone's satisfaction, is how? To the Greeks of Athens and Corinth and Sparta, Macedonia was barely worth the name. It sat at the northern edge of the Greek world, mountainous, rugged, tribal, a place where kings still hunted on horseback and settled disputes with iron rather than rhetoric. The great city-states to the south had their philosophies, their theaters, their marble temples. Macedonia had timber, silver, and hard men who knew how to fight. The Greeks tolerated it as a neighbor and privately dismissed it as a backwater. That condescension had a long history. For most of the 5th century BC, Macedonia was a fragmented kingdom perpetually threatened by Illyrian raiders from the west, Thracian warlords from the north, and the relentless political interference of Athens and Thebes from the south. Its kings ruled by personal authority more than by institution, and personal authority was a fragile thing. When a king died, his sons competed. When his sons were weak, the kingdom fractured. It was a system designed for instability. To the south, the Greek city-states had spent a century tearing each other apart. Athens and Sparta had fought the Great Peloponnesian War and resolved nothing. Thebes had briefly risen to supremacy under the general Epaminondas, a military genius who shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility at the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BC, and then collapsed when he died at Mantinea 9 years later. By the middle of the 4th century, the Greek world was exhausted, fractious, and leaderless. Nobody was watching the north. Philip II changed everything. He came to the Macedonian throne in 359 BC under conditions that would have destroyed a lesser man. His predecessor killed in battle, the kingdom surrounded, the treasury depleted. Within a decade, he had secured the northern borders, seized control of the gold and silver mines at Mount Pangaeus, and turned a tribal fighting force into a professional standing army. He then turned south, and the Greek world finally paid attention. The instrument Philip built was the Macedonian phalanx, infantry formations armed with the sarissa, a pike nearly 18 feet long, more than twice the length of the traditional Greek spear. In formation, 16 ranks deep, it presented a wall of overlapping iron points that no force in the ancient world had yet found an answer to. Philip paired it with heavy cavalry on the flanks and light infantry for harassment and pursuit. Combined, the 3 arms worked as a single system. It was not just better than anything the Greeks had. It was categorically different. Alexander was born in Pella in July of 356 BC, the son of Philip II and his 4th wife Olympias, a princess from Epirus. From his first years, he had 2 voices in his ear pulling in opposite directions. His father taught him war, discipline, endurance, the logic of force. His mother taught him something harder to define, that he was not an ordinary man, that the blood in his veins carried something divine, that his destiny was larger than Macedonia, larger perhaps than anything that had come before. Both of them were right about him, and the tension between those 2 inheritances never fully resolved. His earliest tutor was Leonidas, a stern kinsman of Olympias, who marched the boy on forced exercises before dawn, rationed his food, and believed that hardship was the only honest preparation for command. Leonidas had a point, but it was a later tutor who reached the part of Alexander that force could not touch. In 343 BC, when Alexander was 13, Philip brought Aristotle to Macedonia. The philosopher set up his school at the sanctuary of the nymphs at Mysa, south of Pella, and for 3 years he taught the prince and a small group of Macedonian nobles, boys who would become, in time, Alexander's closest generals and companions. Aristotle taught rhetoric, ethics, politics, medicine, and natural philosophy. He taught Alexander to think in categories, to question assumptions, to understand that the world was knowable if you looked at it carefully enough. But the subject that consumed the young prince most was not philosophy. It was Homer. Aristotle gave Alexander an annotated copy of the Iliad, the great poem of the Trojan War, of glory won and glory lost, of men who fought gods and died young and were remembered forever. Alexander carried that copy on every campaign he ever fought. He slept with it under his pillow beside his dagger. Achilles was the man Alexander measured himself against, not Philip, not any living king. Achilles, the hero of the Iliad, who chose a short, brilliant life over a long, obscure one, who burned so intensely that the gods themselves took notice. Alexander wanted that. He wanted the kind of fame that does not diminish with time, the kind that fills the mouths of strangers centuries after your bones have turned to dust. His tutor Lysimachus had understood this early, casting the boy in childhood games as Achilles and himself as Phoenix, the old hero's guardian. It was a game, but Alexander never quite stopped playing it. By 16, he was no longer a student. Philip left him his region of Macedonia while the king campaigned in Thrace, and within weeks, Alexander had put down a tribal revolt in the north and founded his first city on the captured ground. At 18, he commanded the left wing of the Macedonian cavalry at the Battle of Chaeronea, the decisive engagement in which Philip crushed the combined armies of Athens and Thebes and secured Macedonian dominance over Greece. It was Alexander's cavalry charge that broke the Theban sacred band, the finest infantry unit in the Greek world, and ended the battle. Philip watched his son ride back from the rout. He did not need to say anything. Philip II was not a man Alexander could simply admire from a distance. He was everywhere. In the army Alexander trained with, in the campaigns Alexander learned from, in the court that measured every young man against its king. Philip had come to the throne in 359 BC with almost nothing and built the most effective military force in the Greek world within a decade. He was magnetic, restless, and utterly without sentiment when sentiment got in the way of results. For a son who wanted to be the greatest man alive, having Philip as a father was both an education and an obstacle. Their relationship had fracture lines running through it from early on. Philip had multiple wives, a common Macedonian practice, but his last marriage, in 338 BC to a young Macedonian noblewoman named Cleopatra, was different. Her uncle Attalus, drunk at the wedding banquet, made a toast calling on the assembled Macedonians to pray for a legitimate heir to the throne. The insult was deliberate and public. It questioned whether Alexander, son of the foreign-born Olympias, was truly Macedonian enough to rule. Alexander hurled a goblet at Attalus. Philip drew his sword and lunged at his own son, drunk and stumbling. He fell. Alexander stood over him and said, quietly, that here was the man who was preparing to cross from Europe into Asia, and he could not make it from one couch to another. Then he left Macedonia and taking his mother with him. The rupture did not last. Philip eventually negotiated a reconciliation, and Alexander returned to Pella. But something had shifted. The question of succession was now openly contested, at least in the minds of court factions, and Alexander knew it. He was not the only son Philip had. There was Aridaeus, older, intellectually limited, but Macedonian through both parents. The court was full of men calculating their futures around which prince would survive. Alexander understood precisely what kind of world he had been born into. In October of 336 BC, at Aegae, the ancient Macedonian capital, Philip was assassinated. He was attending the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, and had walked into the theater ahead of his bodyguards, a deliberate gesture of openness to the watching Greek dignitaries. The assassin was Pausanias, one of his own bodyguards, a man with a long festering personal grievance against Philip for a humiliation the king had refused to punish. Pausanias stabbed Philip between the ribs and ran. He was caught before he reached his horses and killed on the spot. Philip died within moments, in public, in front of the Greek world he had spent his life trying to impress. Whether anyone else was behind the killing has never been established with certainty. Olympias was suspected. Alexander was suspected. Ancient sources gesture at both without convicting either. What is not disputed is what happened immediately after. Alexander was proclaimed king within hours. Two potential rivals at court were executed before they had time to move. Orders went to Asia Minor to eliminate Attalus, the man who had questioned Alexander's legitimacy at the wedding feast 2 years earlier. The speed was remarkable. The readiness was more remarkable still. Philip had built a machine for conquest. His son inherited it, and he was not going to let anyone take it from him. The Macedonian court had never been a place for the hesitant. Kings survived by moving faster than their enemies, and Alexander moved at a pace that left little room for anyone to organize against him. Within days of Philip's death, he had identified and eliminated the men most likely to contest his rule. 2 brothers from a rival noble line, Hieramenes and Arrhabaeus, were accused of involvement in the assassination and executed. A 3rd brother, C. Alexander of Lyncestis, survived only because he was among the first to come forward and swear loyalty to the new king. Loyalty, offered quickly enough, could buy a man his life. News of Philip's death reached the Greek city-states like a signal fire. Athens celebrated openly. Thebes began making plans. The tribes on Macedonia's northern and western borders stirred. To the south, the carefully constructed League of Corinth, Philip's alliance of Greek states built to provide the manpower and political cover for the Persian campaign, seemed suddenly fragile. The man who had held it together was dead. His successor was 20 years old and unproven. Many in Greece assumed that the Macedonian grip would loosen now if it could be pressured hard enough and quickly enough. They misjudged him. Now Alexander moved south at a speed that his opponents could not match. He marched through Thessaly and appeared in central Greece before any city had coordinated a response. Athens, which had been on the verge of open opposition, sent envoys instead. Alexander received them coolly and accepted their expressions of loyalty. He then descended on Corinth, where the League was reformed under his leadership, with Alexander confirmed as hegemon and commander of the Persian expedition. Only Sparta refused, as it had refused his father. Alexander noted the refusal and did nothing. Sparta was a spent force by 336 BC. It was not worth the delay. With the south pacified, he turned north. In the spring of 335 BC, he campaigned through Thrace and into Illyria, and defeating each threat in turn with a speed and tactical precision that silenced any remaining doubts about his military command. He was not just holding his father's kingdom together, he was demonstrating to his own army as much as to his enemies that the campaigns would continue, that the plan was still on. Then, while he was deep in Illyria, rumors spread through Greece that he was dead. Thebes believed the rumors, or chose to. The city expelled its Macedonian garrison and declared independence. Athens sent weapons. Other states waited. When Alexander appeared in Boeotia less than 2 weeks later, 300 miles in 13 days, the Thebans could not believe it was him. They assumed it was a different Macedonian general. It was not. He offered terms: surrender the rebellion's leaders, and the rest would be spared. The Thebes refused. The city fell within days. 6,000 Thebans died in the fighting. More than 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery. Every building in the city was razed, with 3 exceptions: the temples, the Macedonian garrison's fortress, and the house of the poet Pindar, whom Alexander admired. The message spread across Greece faster than any army could march. There were no more revolts. The army Alexander inherited from Philip was unlike anything that had existed before in the Greek world. It was not a citizen militia that assembled in emergencies and dispersed to its farms in winter. It was a professional force, paid year-round, drilled continuously, organized around permanent unit structures, and loyal first to its commander and only second to whatever city or tribe it came from. Well, Philip had essentially invented the standing army in the Greek world, and the men who filled it had spent years learning to move and fight as a single organism. The core of the infantry was the phalanx. Several thousand Macedonian foot soldiers, known as the Persepolis, or foot companions, armed with the Sarissa, a double-pointed pike nearly 18 feet long. In close formation, 16 ranks deep, the first 5 rows of men lowered their sarissas parallel to the ground, while the rear ranks angled theirs upward to deflect incoming missiles. What an enemy standing opposite the phalanx saw was not soldiers, but a wall of overlapping iron points, more spearheads than there were bodies to aim at. Nothing in the ancient world could push through that formation from the front. Yet the problem was that nothing could move it quickly either. The phalanx needed flat, open ground, and it was dangerously vulnerable on its flanks and rear. That vulnerability was the reason the Hyphasis existed. These were 3,000 elite infantry, drawn from the Macedonian nobility, trained to a higher standard than the regular phalanx, and equipped with shorter weapons that gave them speed and flexibility the Sarissamen could never match. They held the right flank of the phalanx in battle, acting as a hinge between the heavy infantry and the cavalry. And they were the men Alexander sent into sieges, mountain passes, and river crossings where the phalanx could not go. They were also, in peacetime, the king's personal guard. Their loyalty was to Alexander, not to the army in general. And the shock force of the army was the companion cavalry, around 1,800 heavy horsemen drawn from the Macedonian and Thessalian nobility, armed with a 9-foot lance and organized into 8 squadrons of roughly 200 men each. They fought in a wedge formation that concentrated maximum force at a single point, punching through gaps in the enemy line rather than engaging along a broad front. In battle, the phalanx was the anvil that pinned the enemy in place. The companion cavalry was the hammer that broke them. Alexander commanded the royal squadron himself, always on the right wing, always leading the decisive charge in person. What made the system extraordinary was not any single element, but the way the 3 arms, heavy infantry, elite foot guards, and shock cavalry, operated as a coordinated whole. Lighter troops filled the gaps. Agrianian javelin throwers from the northern Balkans handled rough terrain and skirmishing. Thessalian and Thracian cavalry screened the left wing and pursued broken enemies. Each arm covered the weaknesses of the others. Philip had designed the system and tested it at Chaeronea. Alexander had studied it at Chaeronea, standing on the left wing at the age of 18, watching the parts move. He understood it from the inside out, and over the next 11 years, he would take it further than Philip had ever imagined. The empire Alexander was preparing to invade was the largest the world had ever seen. Founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC, the Achaemenid Persian Empire had grown over 2 centuries into a dominion stretching from the shores of Libya and the Aegean Sea in the west to the banks of the Indus River in the east, a territory of some 5.5 million square kilometers, encompassing dozens of languages, dozens of peoples, and accumulated wealth that no Greek could fully imagine. Babylon alone was among the richest cities in the world. Persepolis, the ceremonial capital, was built on a scale that made Athens look modest. The machinery that held it together was the satrapal system, an administrative framework of provincial governors called satraps, who ruled their territories on the king's behalf, collected taxes, maintained order, raised troops in wartime, and sent tribute to the royal capitals at Susa, Persepolis, and Ecbatana. At its best, the system allowed a single king to govern an empire too vast to personally administer. Darius the Great had expanded it across 36 provinces, imposed fixed taxation, built a road network that could move royal messengers from Susa to Sardis, a journey of 1,500 miles in a week. The empire ran on information, logistics, and local compliance, and for most of 2 centuries, it ran well. By the time Alexander crossed the Hellespont, the system was under strain. The 4th century had been a difficult one for Persian kings. Egypt had revolted and been reconquered. Satraps in the western provinces had periodically acted as independent rulers, pursuing their own wars and their own alliances. When the royal court had been poisoned by palace intrigue, Darius III himself had come to the throne in 336 BC through the maneuvering of the eunuch Bagoas, who had arranged the deaths of 2 previous kings before Darius forced him to drink his own poison. The man who would face Alexander had begun his reign by surviving a murder plot engineered by the man who installed him. Darius III was not the weak king Greek sources made him out to be. Before becoming king, he had served as satrap of Armenia, and there is an account of him accepting a personal challenge to single combat during a campaign in his youth, and winning. He was capable, experienced, and not without courage. What he lacked was time. He inherited an empire already carrying the wounds of a difficult decade, a court accustomed to intrigue, satraps accustomed to autonomy, and an army that was vast but not cohesive. When Alexander invaded, Darius did not have the luxury of starting from strength. He was managing damage from the moment the Macedonians crossed the water. The Persian army at its core was formidable. The empire could call on cavalry from Armenia, Bactria, and India, infantry from Babylon, Syria, and Egypt, Greek mercenaries who fought as well as any soldiers in the ancient world, and the personal household troops of the king himself, including the elite infantry regiment known as the Immortals, 10,000 strong, the finest foot soldiers in Persian service. What Persian armies consistently struggled to provide was tactical coordination across such enormous diversity of forces, and above all, a general capable of keeping a heterogeneous host moving and fighting as one. Now, that was the gap Alexander was about to exploit. In the spring of 334 BC, Alexander led his army to the Hellespont, the narrow strait of water separating Europe from Asia. The crossing itself was straightforward enough. 160 warships and a fleet of transports, roughly 40,000 men in total, ferried across in stages. But Alexander did not cross with the main body. He took a detachment of ships separately, steered them himself to the middle of the strait, and hurled a spear into the Asian shore from the prow before the boat had landed. It was a gesture for the army watching from the water, for the Greek world watching from a distance, and perhaps most of all, for himself. Asia, he was declaring, was Spear-won territory, a gift from the gods claimed before a single battle had been fought. His first destination after landing was not the Persian army. It was Troy, the ancient city, or what remained of it, partially resettled under the name Ilion, lay a short march from the landing point, and Alexander went there deliberately with a small group of his closest companions. At the Temple of Athena, he dedicated his armor and took down a set of weapons said to date from the Trojan War. Then, he went to the tomb of Achilles. He anointed the gravestone with oil, ran naked around it with his companions in the ancient ritual of honor for the dead, and placed a garland on the stone. He stood there and said that Achilles had been fortunate in having a faithful friend while he lived and a poet great enough to make his name immortal after he died. The remark was not casual. Alexander had been thinking about it for years. Hephaestion, Alexander's closest companion since boyhood, laid his own garland at a nearby tomb identified as that of Patroclus, Achilles' beloved friend in the Iliad. The parallel was deliberate, and everyone present understood it. Alexander was Achilles. Hephaestion was Patroclus. The war against Persia was the new Trojan War, and they were standing at the place where the old one had been fought, performing the rites that connected the living to the heroic dead. Whether Alexander believed this literally or understood it as theater is a question the sources cannot answer. What is clear is that he made no distinction between the two. The visit to Troy was also a political performance aimed at the Greek cities of Asia Minor, most of which were under Persian control and had lived that way for generations. Alexander's message was that he had come not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, the champion of Greek civilization, finishing a war that had begun when Xerxes burned the Athenian Acropolis in 480 BC. The framing was useful. It gave the campaign a moral justification that went beyond Macedonian ambition, and it gave the Greek populations of Asia a reason to open their gates rather than defend Persian rule. Whether the liberation was genuine or rhetorical was a question that would only be answered later, as the campaign proceeded and Alexander's methods became clearer. From Troy, he marched inland. Word had already reached the Persian satraps of Asia Minor that the Macedonian army had crossed, and they were assembling their forces. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek general in Persian service, now one of the most capable commanders in the empire, urged them to avoid battle, burn the countryside, and let hunger and supply problems dissolve the invasion before it could gain momentum. The satraps rejected the advice. They were not willing to destroy their own provinces, and they did not believe that any Greek army, however well organized, could stand against Persian cavalry in open ground. They chose a defensive position on the eastern bank of the river Granicus and waited. Alexander came directly at them. The Granicus River was not a formidable obstacle by the standards of what Alexander would later cross, but it was a good defensive position. The eastern bank was steep and high, and the Persian cavalry, 10,000 horsemen drawn from the satrapies of Asia Minor, was drawn up along it in a solid wall, with several thousand Greek mercenary infantry held in reserve behind them. The Persians intended to use the difficult crossing to break the momentum of Alexander's advance and cut down his cavalry as it struggled up the far bank. Parmenion, Alexander's most experienced general, advised waiting until dawn the next day, when conditions would be better. Alexander replied that it would be a disgrace to let a river stop him after he had already crossed the Hellespont, and ordered the attack that afternoon. The assault began with a diversionary thrust to the left, intended to draw Persian attention and create space on the right. Then, Alexander led his companion cavalry in a diagonal advance into the river, riding directly toward the strongest section of the Persian line. The crossing was brutal, the current fast, the bank steep, none of the Persians hurling javelins and darts down at the men below. Those who reached the top of the bank were immediately met by Persian horsemen pushing forward to throw them back. The fighting was dense and close and without order. Men and horses jammed against each other at the water's edge. Alexander was fighting in the middle of it, recognizable by his white helmet plumes, and the Persian commanders concentrated their attention on him. Mithridates, Darius's own son-in-law, rode at Alexander and was struck down by a devastating lance blow. Rusaces struck Alexander on the head with a sword hard enough to shear off part of his helmet's plume and crack the metal beneath. Alexander killed him through the chest. A third Persian noble, Spithridates, came in from behind with his weapon already raised, and Cleitus the Black, one of Alexander's senior cavalry officers and the man who had been his wet nurse's brother since childhood, struck Spithridates down before the blow could land, saving the king's life in the final fraction of a second. Alexander fought on, apparently unaware of how close it had been. Once enough Macedonian cavalry had gained the eastern bank, the Persian line began to buckle. The shock of the phalanx, now crossing in numbers, removed any remaining Persian hope of holding the river. The cavalry turned and fled, and the Persian infantry levies fled with them. The Greek mercenaries did not. They held their ground on a piece of higher terrain beyond the river, formed into their phalanx, and sent word to Alexander asking for terms. He gave them none. He surrounded them with cavalry and infantry and ordered the attack. If the battle to destroy the mercenaries was harder and bloodier than the battle against the Persian cavalry had been. The Greek hoplites fought with discipline and desperation, and most of the Macedonian casualties of the day were taken here. When it was over, the survivors, perhaps 2,000 men, were sent back to Macedonia in chains to work in the mines. Alexander sent 300 sets of captured Persian armor to Athens to be hung on the Acropolis as a votive offering. The inscription he had fixed above them noted specifically that they were a gift from Alexander and all the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians. The Granicus opened Asia Minor. Sardis, the great Persian provincial capital of Lydia, surrendered without a fight within days. Other cities followed. The road south was open. But the victory also established something about Alexander that would not change. He fought from the front in personal danger, leading the charge rather than directing it from a position of safety. It was the style Achilles would have recognized. It was also, as Spithridates had nearly demonstrated, the style most likely to get him killed. The men who served him understood both things. So did Alexander. He simply did not consider the second one worth worrying about. After the Granicus, the Persian provincial capitals of Western Asia Minor fell quickly. Sardis, seat of the satrap of Lydia and one of the richest cities in the empire, surrendered without a fight. Its commander had no orders and no realistic prospect of relief, and he made a rational decision. Ephesus opened its gates. Other cities along the Aegean coast followed, now most of them welcoming Alexander with more enthusiasm than the circumstances strictly required. The welcome was genuine in some cases and calculated in others, but it served Alexander's purposes regardless. He installed democratic governments in the cities that had been under Persian-backed oligarchies, canceled the tribute that had previously gone to Persia, and made a point of being seen as a restorer rather than a conqueror. The strategic problem was the Persian fleet. Persia controlled the eastern Mediterranean with several hundred warships based at ports along the Anatolian coast, and Alexander had nothing comparable at sea. His own fleet of 160 ships was adequate for transport, but could not fight a sustained naval campaign against Persian numbers. Memnon of Rhodes, now commanding Persian naval operations in the west, understood the opportunity this created. If the fleet could threaten the Greek islands and the Macedonian coastline, Alexander would be forced to divert troops homeward or fight on a second front he could not afford. Alexander's answer was to eliminate the ports themselves. Without bases, the fleet could not operate. He would conquer the sea from the land. Miletus, a major port city on the Ionian coast, was the first serious test. A Persian fleet of 400 warships arrived just too late to prevent Alexander's smaller force from blockading the harbor, and Miletus fell after a short siege. Alexander then made a decision that surprised his officers. He disbanded almost his entire fleet, keeping only 20 Athenian ships. He could not afford to maintain it, and he had concluded that the most effective use of his naval forces was as a demonstration of Athenian loyalty rather than as a fighting force. The army would take the ports. The ships were redundant. Halicarnassus was a harder problem. The city sat on a fortified peninsula on the southwestern coast, defended by Memnon himself with a garrison of Persian troops and Greek mercenaries, backed by the Persian fleet lying offshore. Alexander brought his siege engines up by sea and began battering the walls. Memnon's defenders fought back with catapults and repeated sorties, and for weeks, neither side could force a decision. The breakthrough came when Macedonian infantry managed to push through a section of wall at night, surprising the garrison. Memnon, recognizing the city was lost, set it on fire and withdrew his forces by sea. Alexander ordered the flames extinguished and issued a decree protecting the civilian population. He then placed Ada, the deposed queen of Caria, who had allied with him and formally adopted him as her son, on the throne of the province. The liberator framing was holding. Memnon died of illness the following spring while leading Persian naval operations in the Aegean. His death removed the one Persian commander who had consistently outthought Alexander's strategic position, and the naval threat to the Greek mainland evaporated with him. Darius had lost his most dangerous Western commander without a battle to fever. Alexander, receiving the news somewhere on the road east, kept moving. The coast was secured. The interior waited. In the spring of 333 BC, Alexander marched north and then inland to Gordium, the ancient capital of Phrygia, where the army wintered and received reinforcements from Macedonia. Gordium was an old city with a long memory. In its citadel stood an ox cart that had belonged to Gordius, the legendary peasant king who founded the dynasty of Midas. The yoke of the cart was fastened to its pole by a knot of cornel bark, wound so intricately that no end was visible and no one had ever been able to find where to begin unpicking it. The local oracle was clear on what the knot meant. Whoever loosed it was destined to rule all of Asia. Alexander went to the citadel and examined the knot. He wrestled with it for a time, turning it in his hands, finding no purchase. Then he stepped back and announced that it made no difference how the knot was loosed, only that it was loosed. He drew his sword and cut it in half. Whether he believed the prophecy or was simply performing it for the army watching is a question the sources do not resolve. What is certain is that the men present understood exactly what had happened. Their king had just claimed the kingship of Asia, in public, in front of a religious oracle, before a single Persian heartland city had fallen. He was 23 years old. From Gordium, Alexander pushed east through Cappadocia and down toward Cilicia, the narrow coastal plain of what is now southern Turkey, hemmed between the Taurus Mountains and the sea. He moved fast, trying to pass through the Cilician Gates, a narrow mountain pass, before the Persians could fortify it. The pass was left unguarded when the local Persian governor, Arsames, withdrew rather than defend it. Alexander's vanguard came through at a run, in full armor, and then secured the road south to Tarsus. At Tarsus, he nearly died, not in battle, but in the river. He plunged into the cold waters of the Cydnus to wash off the dust of the march, and within hours was seized by a violent fever and convulsions. His physicians gathered around him. Most refused to attempt a cure, afraid of the consequences if their treatment failed. Only Philip of Acarnania, his personal physician, was willing to act. He prepared a medicine. At the same moment, Alexander received a letter from Parmenion, warning him that Philip had been bribed by Darius to poison the king. Alexander read the letter, showed it to Philip without a word, and drank the medicine. Philip read the accusation against himself while Alexander watched him from the bed. The medicine worked. Alexander recovered over the following weeks, but the army had been halted for months that Darius used to march a massive Persian force toward the border. When Alexander was well enough to ride, Darius had already moved. The Persian king had grown impatient waiting for Alexander to appear, convinced by reports of the Macedonian's illness that his opponent was too frightened to advance. He led his army through the mountains into Cilicia by a different pass, emerging behind Alexander's lines at the town of Issus, where Alexander had left his sick and wounded. The Persians killed the men they found there. Alexander learned that Darius was not ahead of him, but behind him. He turned the army around and marched back north at full speed. Darius, realizing too late what had happened, took up a defensive position on the banks of the Pinarus River. The two kings were about to meet. The two armies met on the narrow coastal plain near the town of Issus in November of 333 BC, hemmed between the Amanus Mountains and the sea. The battlefield was barely 2.5 kilometers wide, which suited Alexander exactly. Darius had assembled a force that almost certainly outnumbered the Macedonians by 2 to 1, perhaps more. drawing on infantry from Syria and Babylonia, Greek mercenaries, and the finest cavalry from across the empire. On open ground, that number would have been decisive. On this narrow strip of coast, most of it was irrelevant. The sea and the mountains compressed the battlefield into a corridor where Macedonian discipline and shock tactics could function exactly as they had at the Granicus. Darius deployed his best cavalry on his right wing toward the sea, where the ground was firmest for horses. His Greek mercenary infantry, his most reliable foot soldiers, held the center. Persian infantry filled the left. He positioned himself at the heart of the formation in his royal chariot, surrounded by his household guard. Alexander surveyed the line and moved his Thessalian cavalry quietly across to reinforce Parmenion on the left, where the Persian horsemen were strongest. Then, he took his place on the right wing with the companion cavalry directly opposite the weakest section of Darius's line. He had already decided where the battle would be won. Alexander led the charge at a pace that gave the Persian infantry no time to settle. His cavalry smashed through the Persian left and wheeled inward, driving straight toward the center where Darius stood. In the middle of the battlefield, the Macedonian phalanx ran into real trouble. Crossing the Pinarus River broke the formation, and Darius's Greek mercenaries pushed hard into the gap, inflicting the heaviest Macedonian casualties of the day. But Alexander was already inside the Persian line. He fought his way toward the royal chariot. Darius, facing encirclement, abandoned his chariot, mounted a horse, and fled north into the mountains. The moment his standard disappeared from the battlefield, the Persian army began to collapse. On the left wing, Parmenion held. The Persian cavalry pressed him hard for most of the battle, and his situation was genuinely desperate at several points. But when news of Darius's flight reached the Persian horsemen, they disengaged and fled too. The pursuit continued until nightfall, and Alexander suffered a wound to the thigh during the fighting. The sources disagree on whether it came from a sword or a lance, but he was back on his horse within hours, riding through the camp to check on his wounded men. The Macedonian dead numbered in the hundreds. Persian dead were counted in the tens of thousands. Among the spoils taken from Darius's camp was something no general had ever captured before: the Persian king's entire family. His mother Sisigambis, his wife Statira, and his daughters had accompanied the army on campaign, as was Persian royal custom. When word reached them that the battle was lost and Darius had fled, they began mourning him as dead. Alexander went to them the following morning himself, accompanied only by Hephaestion. He assured them that Darius was alive and that they would be treated as queens. Sisigambis, in the confusion, prostrated herself before Hephaestion, who was taller and more imposing than the king. When the mistake was pointed out, she was mortified. Alexander told her she had made no error, that Hephaestion was also Alexander. It was a generous gesture and a calculated one. The king of Asia could afford to be magnanimous with a king's mother. He was already thinking about what came next. Darius, from exile, sent Alexander a letter. He offered a ransom for his family, a formal alliance, and all Persian territory west of the Euphrates in exchange for peace. Alexander read the letter to his officers and asked for their views. Parmenion, his most senior general, said that if he were Alexander, he would accept those terms. Alexander replied that if he were Parmenion, he would too. Then, he dictated his response to Darius. He already possessed everything west of the Euphrates, and he already held the king's family without paying any ransom. If Darius wanted his family back, he should come in person and ask for them. And if he wanted to dispute the kingship of Asia, he should come and fight for it. Darius had no answer to give except to build another army. He went east to do exactly that. After Issus, the Phoenician cities of the eastern Mediterranean coast fell to Alexander one by one. Byblus surrendered, Sidon surrendered, but Tyre did not. The city sat on an island half a mile offshore, surrounded by walls that rose in places to 45 feet and met the sea directly. There was no beach, no landing point, no angle of approach that conventional siege equipment could reach. Tyre had withstood a 13-year siege by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon 2 centuries earlier. Its citizens knew what they were sitting behind, and they told Alexander that he was welcome to sacrifice in the temple of their god Melkart on the mainland, in Old Tyre, but that the island city would not open its gates to Macedonians or Persians alike. Then, when Alexander sent envoys to negotiate, they killed them and threw their bodies from the walls into the sea. Alexander began the siege in January of 332 BC. His solution was to build a causeway, a road across the water wide enough to carry siege towers and artillery platforms, constructed from the rubble of the abandoned mainland city. Work began immediately, thousands of soldiers and conscripted local laborers hauling stone and timber into the shallows. Close to the shore, where the water was calm and only 2 meters deep, the work went quickly. Then the seafloor shelved sharply downward, the current picked up, and the causeway crept forward at the pace of days per meter. Tyrian warships harassed the workers from the flanks. Archers on the city walls fired into the work gangs throughout the daylight hours. Alexander built 2 siege towers, the largest ever constructed, 50 meters high, and rolled them to the end of the causeway to provide covering fire. The Tyrians destroyed them with a fire ship. They loaded an old horse transport with pitch, sulfur, dried timber, and cauldrons of oil hung from the masts, weighed the stern down so the bow rode high out of the water, set the whole thing alight, and drove it straight into the end of the causeway. The cauldrons fell as the masts burned through. The towers caught, and small Tyrian boats swarmed the causeway while the Macedonian crews fought the flames. The towers were gone within the hour. Alexander widened the causeway and ordered them rebuilt. He also went to Sidon personally to gather a fleet, returning with warships from Cyprus, Phoenicia, and the Aegean, more than 200 vessels in total. Tyre now faced assault from every direction simultaneously. The final attack came in July, 7 months after the siege had begun. Macedonian warships with battering rams worked along the southern wall until a section gave way. Boarding bridges dropped onto the breach, and Alexander's troops poured through. The fighting inside the city was street by street and door by door, the Tyrians selling every meter it cost. 6,000 Tyrian soldiers died in the city. Another 2,000 men, prisoners taken in the fighting, were put to death along the beach in a brutal public display. 30,000 survivors, mostly women and children, were sold into slavery. Alexander spared the king and his family and the citizens who had taken refuge in the temples. The causeway he had built across the water remained after the city fell, accumulated sand against its flanks over the following centuries, and Tyre has been a peninsula ever since. The Tyre Alexander left behind was not the same city he had besieged. Its population was gone, its wealth was distributed among his soldiers, and its famous harbors, which had made it one of the great trading centers of the ancient world, now served Macedonian supply lines. He had accomplished what Nebuchadnezzar could not, and he had done it in 7 months. But the achievement carried a texture that his earlier victories had not. The Granicus was a battle. Issus was a battle. Tyre was something else, a systematic application of force over months against a city of civilians who had refused to cooperate. The liberator who had freed the Greek cities of Asia Minor had burned and enslaved a Phoenician one. Both things were true, and both were Alexander. The second truth was becoming easier to overlook. After the fall of Gaza, Alexander marched southwest into Egypt. The Persian satrap Mazaces had no army worth the name and no prospect of relief. Issus had seen to that. And he handed over the country without resistance. The Egyptians received Alexander not as a conqueror, but as a liberator from Persian rule, which had been resented since Persia's reconquest of Egypt a decade earlier. At Memphis, the ancient religious capital, Alexander offered sacrifice to the Egyptian gods in the traditional manner and was recognized as the legitimate successor to the pharaohs. He was 24 years old, and he had now been received as the ruler of 3 civilizations: Greek, Persian, and Egyptian, each with its own claims on what a king was supposed to be. At the western mouth of the Nile, on a narrow strip of land between the sea and Lake Mareotis, Alexander marked out the boundaries of a new city with grain from his soldiers' rations. The city that would bear his name for the rest of history. Alexandria was not an accident. He chose the site himself, reportedly after a dream, and the location was calculated for maximum strategic and commercial advantage. A natural harbor deep enough for warships, it's a position commanding the sea lanes between the Aegean and the Red Sea, a place where Greek and Egyptian and Phoenician trade could converge under Macedonian governance. He never saw it completed, but it would outlast his empire by centuries and become one of the great cities of the ancient world. In the winter of 332 to 331 BC, Alexander left Egypt's coastline and marched west along the Libyan desert to the Siwah oasis, 300 miles from Alexandria, a journey through waterless terrain that ancient sources described as guided by ravens or serpents when his column lost the road. The Oracle of Zeus Ammon at Siwah was among the most respected in the eastern Mediterranean world, consulted by Greeks, Libyans, and Egyptians alike. Heracles and Perseus, both of whom Alexander claimed as ancestors, were said to have made the same journey. Now, Alexander intended to follow them. Whether he went because he believed in the oracle's power or because he needed to be seen to believe in it is a question the ancient sources cannot answer, and probably one that Alexander himself could not have separated cleanly. He entered the inner sanctuary of the temple alone. The high priest greeted him as the son of Ammon, the Egyptian name for Zeus, king of the gods. In Egypt, this was simply how pharaohs were addressed. Divine sonship was part of the office, not a personal revelation. For a Greek, it was something else entirely. Alexander came out of the sanctuary and said that he had received the answer his heart desired. He never disclosed what was said or what he asked. For the rest of his life, he referred to Zeus Ammon as his father. By the time he died, the coins showed him with the ram's horns of Ammon curving from his temples. The question of whether he was Philip's son or a god's son, planted first by his mother Olympias, who had always insisted on the latter, now had what sounded very much like a divine endorsement. The consequences of Siwah were not immediate, but they were lasting. A man who believes, or has decided to believe, which may amount to the same thing, that he is the son of a god begins to hold himself to a different standard than the men around him. He begins to measure his actions against a scale that ordinary men cannot access and cannot judge. At Siwah, Alexander was given language for something he had felt since childhood, that the normal rules did not apply to him. The oracle did not create that belief. It confirmed it and gave it a name, and sent it back into the world dressed in the authority of the gods. The army that followed him east from Egypt was following a man who had just been told, in the most authoritative religious setting available to the ancient world, that he was not entirely human. Whether or not that was true, he was going to act as though it was. After Egypt, Alexander marched back east through Syria and into Mesopotamia, the flat, riverine heartland of the Persian Empire, the territory between the Tigris and Euphrates, where the oldest cities on earth had been built. Darius had used the time since Issus well. He had assembled a new army on the open plains near the village of Gaugamela, northeast of the city of Arbela, in what is now northern Iraq. His engineers had cleared and leveled the ground in advance, now removing rocks and scrub to create the flattest possible terrain, ideal for the weapon Darius was counting on to reverse his fortunes: the scythed chariot. 200 of them waited behind the Persian front line, blades mounted at the axles, designed to tear through infantry formations at speed. Darius had also brought 15 war elephants from India, cavalry from Bactria and Scythia, and contingents from every province of the empire. His army outnumbered Alexander's by perhaps 2-1. On ground, he had personally prepared for the fight. Alexander halted his army several miles from the Persian position and spent 4 days in a fortified camp, gathering intelligence from prisoners and scouts. His officers urged a night attack to offset Persian numbers. Alexander refused. He would not steal a victory. He said, and a night engagement on unfamiliar, potentially trapped ground against a force that size was more likely to produce confusion than surprise. He slept soundly the night before the battle, as his biographer Plutarch records, to the astonishment of his generals. At dawn on October 1st, 331 BC, he led the army forward in battle order. The Persian line, stretching further than the eye could follow, was already in position across the plain. Alexander's formation addressed every tactical problem the ground posed. His phalanx held the center. The companion cavalry under his personal command anchored the right. The Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion held the left. But the wings were not squared off. They were angled back, refused, so that cavalry sweeping around the flanks would find themselves striking infantry at an oblique angle rather than into an open rear. Behind the main line, a second line of infantry faced outward in both directions, ready to turn and meet any encirclement. The entire army was a hollow square that could fight in any direction simultaneously. Alexander had solved the problem of being outnumbered on open ground by making the geometry of his formation do the work that numbers could not. The battle opened with Alexander leading his right wing obliquely to the right, marching away from the leveled ground Darius had prepared. It was a slow, deliberate drift that alarmed the Persian commanders. If Alexander moved far enough, the chariots would be useless and the carefully prepared terrain wasted. Darius sent his Scythian and Bactrian cavalry around the Macedonian right to force Alexander back. There was hard, costly fighting on that flank. The Scythians were heavily armored and outnumbered the Macedonian screening cavalry. But Alexander kept the wing moving, trading space for time while his screen absorbed the pressure. Then, Darius launched his chariots. The Agrianean javelin throwers and archers cut down horses and drivers as they came. The Macedonian infantry opened lanes in the phalanx formation and let the surviving chariots pass through harmlessly to be dealt with by the rear guard. The chariots had been the centerpiece of Darius's preparation. They accomplished almost nothing. The Persian left had stretched itself, trying to match Alexander's rightward drift, and a gap opened between it and the center of the Persian line. Now Alexander saw it form. He swung the companion cavalry hard left, drove the Hypaspists and 4 battalions of the phalanx in behind them, and charged straight into the gap at the full gallop. The blow struck the Persian center like a wedge, driving through the infantry and straight toward the position where Darius stood in his royal chariot. The Persian center buckled and then broke. Darius, facing encirclement for the second time in 2 years, turned his horse and fled east. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion was in serious danger. A mass of Persian and Indian cavalry had punched through a gap in the Greek line and poured into the Macedonian camp behind him. Rather than wheeling to attack the Macedonian rear, they looted the baggage. Parmenion, meanwhile, was pressed so hard that he sent an urgent messenger to Alexander asking for help. Here, Alexander had to abandon his pursuit of Darius and turn the companion cavalry back across the battlefield. The fighting as he crashed into the Persian right wing was the bloodiest of the day. 60 of his companions died in that last cavalry action, among the highest-ranking losses of the entire campaign. When the Persian horsemen finally broke, the battle was over. Gaugamela was the end of Persia as a military power. The road to Babylon, to Susa, to Persepolis, to every city and treasury and symbol of empire, lay open. Darius had prepared the perfect ground, assembled the largest army he could field, and deployed every weapon in the Persian arsenal. He had been beaten by a man who used the geometry of the battlefield itself as his primary weapon. who gave away ground willingly because he understood that space was worth less than a gap in the enemy line. Alexander received the news of the victory in the dark, somewhere in the dust of the pursuit, and turned the army toward Babylon. After Gaugamela, the great cities of the Persian Empire opened before Alexander like a hand unclenching. Babylon, the largest city in the world, home to 500,000 people, seat of kings going back 3,000 years, surrendered without a fight. Its Persian governor Mazaeus rode out to meet Alexander on the road and offered the city's submission. Alexander entered through the Ishtar Gate, the immense blue-tiled portal decorated with lions and dragons that had stood for 2 centuries on a chariot to the sound of music and the scattering of flowers by the crowd. He made offerings at the great temple of Marduk. He confirmed the city's privileges and its priests in their offices. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order, the legitimate successor to the Achaemenid kings who had governed the city before him. The Babylonians accepted the framing without visible resistance. They had changed rulers before. Susa fell next, equally intact. The treasury alone held the equivalent of 50,000 talents of silver. Wealth accumulated over 2 centuries of tribute from every corner of the empire. Alexander had it loaded onto whatever transport could be found, 10,000 mules, 5,000 camels, and still the counting went on for days. He sent back to Athens the bronze statues of the tyrannicides Harmodius and Aristogeiton, which Xerxes had carried off as loot when he burned the Acropolis in 480 BC. The gesture was calculated and effective. Alexander the Avenger, returning stolen Greek property, vindicating everything his campaign had claimed to be. The road to Persepolis ran through the Zagros Mountains, and in the winter of 330 BC, a Persian officer named Ariobarzanes blocked the key pass, the Persian gates, with a force of infantry and archers behind a wall he had built across the narrow gorge. Alexander's first assault was repulsed with heavy losses, the Macedonians caught in the pass with no room to deploy. He withdrew, found a local guide who knew a mountain track that bypassed the position, and sent a column through the snow at night. They came down behind the Persian line at dawn. Ariobarzanes and most of his men died there, and in the pass they had held for a month, surrounded in the end by the army they had stopped. The road to Persepolis was open. Persepolis was the ceremonial heart of the Persian Empire, not an administrative capital like Susa or a commercial city like Babylon, but the symbolic seat of Achaemenid power, the place where the kings of kings received tribute from the nations of the world, where their tombs were cut into the cliffs of the surrounding mountains. Its treasury held more concentrated wealth than anywhere else on earth. Alexander let his soldiers sack the residential quarters of the city on the day of arrival, killing the men they found and enslaving the women. He held the palace complex itself under guard for 4 months, using it as his winter residence until the night in May of 330 BC when it burned. And ancient sources describe a banquet, wine, a torchlit procession through the palace halls, and an Athenian courtesan named Thais, the companion of Alexander's general Ptolemy, who proposed that they burn the palace of Xerxes in revenge for the destruction of Athens. Alexander, drunk, led the procession himself. By morning, the great audience halls, the columned throne room, the archives of cuneiform tablets going back generations, all of it was gone. Ancient sources note that he regretted it the following day, and that the fire may have spread further than intended. Whether the burning was a drunken impulse or a premeditated political act is a question the evidence cannot resolve. What is certain is that Persepolis never recovered. Now, in Alexander's claim to be the legitimate successor of the Persian kings, the man who had come to restore, not destroy, became very difficult to sustain the morning after. After Persepolis, Alexander marched north to Ecbatana, the last of the great Persian capitals, set high in the Zagros Mountains in what is now northwestern Iran. Darius had been there, gathering whatever forces he could. By the time Alexander arrived, the Persian king was gone again, moving east through the Caspian gates toward Bactria, hoping to raise a new army in the eastern provinces and continue the war from distance. Alexander pushed his cavalry at a pace that broke horses, covering enormous distances through the summer heat of the Iranian plateau, rotating mounts, discarding anything that slowed him. He was closing the gap, and Darius knew it. Now, in the Persian column, the mood had changed. Bessus, satrap of Bactria, one of the most powerful men in the Eastern Empire and a distant relative of the Achaemenid royal line, had been watching Darius's authority dissolve battle by battle. He conspired with two other senior officers, Nabarzanes and Barcentes, and they arrested Darius on the march, bound him, and threw him into a covered wagon in golden chains. Their plan was to use him as a bargaining chip, to offer Alexander the deposed king in exchange for their own lives and positions. Then, Alexander's cavalry came over the horizon faster than any of them had expected, and the plan collapsed in panic. Bessus and his companions stabbed Darius through the sides with their javelins and fled east with 600 horsemen, leaving the king to bleed out in the wagon on the road. A Macedonian soldier found Darius alive, or barely so, and brought him water. He died before Alexander arrived. The sources record that Alexander covered the body with his own cloak. He took Darius's signet ring from his finger. He sent the body to Persepolis to be buried in the royal tombs alongside the Achaemenid kings, with the full honors due a king of kings. Whether this was genuine grief for a fallen rival or a performance designed for the Persian nobility watching from a distance, the political effect was identical. Alexander positioned himself as the avenger of a murdered king, the rightful heir of the Achaemenid dynasty, the man obligated by honor and legitimacy to pursue the assassins. He gave the war a new name, the justification that had carried the campaign from the Hellespont, revenge for Greece. A punishment for Xerxes' burning of Athens, liberation of the Greek cities of Asia, had served its purpose and was now exhausted. Persia was conquered. There was nothing left to avenge and nothing left to liberate. But Alexander was not finished, and he needed a reason that his men, his Greek allies, and the Persian nobility he was trying to govern could all accept. The death of Darius provided it. He was now pursuing a usurper and a regicide. He was now, in a meaningful sense, the Persian king, not by conquest alone, but by inheritance. It was a transformation of identity so large that it required most of the next 3 years to complete, and it would cost him nearly everything he had built with the men who had followed him from Macedonia. Bessus retreated to Bactria and declared himself king of kings under the throne name Artaxerxes V, invoking the Achaemenid dynasty he had just destroyed. He was not entirely without support in the east, where the satraps were accustomed to managing their own affairs and had little reason to love the Macedonians. But his claim was fatally compromised by the manner in which he had taken it. Persian nobles and priests valued legitimacy above almost everything else, and a man who had murdered his king in a covered wagon had none. When Alexander crossed into Bactria in pursuit, Bessus's allies began calculating their own futures. The satrap Spitamenes and another officer named Dadaphurnes arrested Bessus and handed him to Alexander's advance forces in 329 BC. Alexander had Bessus brutally disfigured, the traditional Persian punishment for a traitor, and sent him to Ecbatana, where a Persian court tried and executed him. The kingslayer had been punished by the king's avenger. The performance of Persian legitimacy was complete, and the hardest part of the campaign had not yet begun. After Bessus was handed over and disposed of, Alexander pushed north across the Oxus River into Sogdia, the territory of modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, a land of river valleys, desert steppe, and mountain ranges that bore no resemblance to the open plains of Mesopotamia where his army had been designed to fight. He founded a city on the Jaxartes River at the far northeastern edge of the Persian Empire, Alexandria Eschaton, Alexandria the furthest, and assumed that the region was now his. It was not. Within weeks, a Sogdian chieftain named Spidomenes raised the entire province in revolt, besieged the Macedonian garrison at Maracanda, and sent a detachment of Alexander's forces under a commander named Pharnuches into an ambush from which only 300 of the original 2,000 soldiers escaped alive. It was the worst single military reverse of Alexander's career. Spidomenes was everything the Persian commanders Alexander had faced before were not. He did not stand and fight. He appeared, struck, and vanished back into the steppe, using the landscape the way a fish uses water, moving through terrain that swallowed cavalry pursuit and made the Sarissa phalanx useless. He could draw on Scythian horsemen from across the Oxus, men who had no cities to protect and no fixed territory to defend, which meant there was nothing for Alexander to threaten or destroy that would make them stop. Alexander spent nearly 3 years in Bactria and Sogdia, an almost unimaginable amount of time for a man who had conquered the Persian heartland in under 2 years. He never caught Spidomenes in open battle once. His response to the insurgency was systematic and brutal. He divided his army into columns and swept through the Sogdian countryside, destroying every settlement that had supported the revolt. Ancient sources describe cities demolished, populations enslaved, and fields burned across the Polytimetus Valley and beyond. At the Siege of Persepolis, one of 7 Sogdian cities taken in a single campaign, Alexander was struck in the throat by a stone and briefly lost his voice. At another assault, he took an arrow through the leg that shattered the shin bone. He fought through both injuries and kept moving. The army followed, but the army was watching what was happening to the man who led it. Approximately 7,000 Macedonian soldiers died in Bactria and Sogdia, more than in any comparable period of the campaign. Many died not in battle, but from cold, heat, and the grinding physical cost of years in a landscape that offered nothing. The blizzards on the Hindu Kush passes and the furnace heat of the Karakum Desert between Bactria and the Oxus killed men who had survived Issus and Gaugamela. The army that had followed Alexander east from Greece with confidence and momentum was now exhausted and far from home, fighting an enemy it could not pin down, in a country it could not understand, and for reasons that were becoming harder to explain. They had come to destroy the Persian Empire. That had been accomplished years ago. What they were doing now had a different name and a different feeling, and nobody used the word victory. Spidomenes was eventually betrayed in the winter of 328 BC. Killed by the Scythian allies who had concluded that their cause was lost, his head sent to Alexander as a peace offering. The revolt subsided. Alexander moved to consolidate control through a combination of garrisons, new settlements, and strategic marriages, encouraging his officers to take local wives. He took one himself. At the Sogdian Rock, a fortress considered impregnable by its defenders, who told Alexander he would need soldiers with wings to take it. He met a Bactrian nobleman's daughter named Roxana. They were married in 327 BC. The Macedonian officers disapproved, quietly and then less quietly. Alexander had married a barbarian without consulting his court, without the elaborate diplomatic apparatus that surrounded Persian royal marriages. He had simply done it. It was the kind of decision a man makes when he has stopped asking permission. The 3 years in Bactria and Sogdia changed the army in ways that the great battles had not. The battles had been victories, and victories could absorb almost any cost. The guerrilla war had been something else. Years of attrition, injury, burning villages, and marching through snow and desert without a clear horizon where the thing would end. The veterans from Philip's generation had already been watching Alexander adopt Persian dress, Persian court ceremony, Persian methods of governance. In the emptiness of Bactria, with no triumph to distract them and no prospect of going home, that watching had turned into something harder and more dangerous. The conversations that had been held in whispers were getting louder, and Alexander, who missed nothing, could hear them. The night it happened, in the autumn of 328 BC, had begun as a banquet. The army was at Maracanda, modern Samarkand, and Alexander was hosting a dinner to mark the appointment of Cleitus the Black as satrap of Bactria. It was a promotion officially. In practice, Cleitus was being moved to govern a rebellious province at the edge of the known world, away from the king's inner circle, in charge of 16,000 second-line troops, rather than the companion cavalry he had commanded for years. He knew it, and everyone at the table knew it. The wine was strong, and there was a great deal of it. Cleitus had been drinking through the evening when the conversation turned to Alexander's achievements and their source. Young men at the table, the new generation of Macedonian officers who had grown up inside Alexander's court and had no memory of Philip's Macedonia, began comparing the king favorably to the gods, dismissing the older campaigns and the men who had fought them. Someone recited verses mocking Macedonian officers who had recently been defeated by Spitamenes. Cleitus had his limits, and he had reached them. He stood up and reminded the room that those men had died serving the campaign, and that it was the blood of Macedonians, Philip's Macedonians, his generation, that had made every one of Alexander's victories possible. He looked at Alexander and told him directly that his insistence on being the son of Ammon was a betrayal of the father who had actually built everything he now possessed. The room tried to absorb what was happening. Men moved between them. Alexander threw an apple at Cleitus's head. He called for a weapon and was disarmed by the men around him. Cleitus was hustled from the room. He should have kept going. Instead, he came back, reciting lines from Euripides about kings who took credit for victories that belonged to their soldiers. Alexander got hold of a spear from somewhere, the sources differ on exactly how, and drove it through Cleitus's chest. Cleitus died in the room where they had been drinking together. The banquet ended. The palace went quiet. Alexander's grief was immediate and total. He pulled the spear from the body and turned it on himself, and had to be physically restrained by his bodyguards. He locked himself in his quarters and refused to come out for 3 days, refusing food, lying on the ground, calling Cleitus's name, and calling for his sister Lenice, who had been Alexander's wet nurse as an infant, and who had now lost a brother to the man she had nursed. When his officers finally persuaded him to eat, they brought in a philosopher named Anaxarchus, who told Alexander that a king was by definition the measure of justice, and that what a king did could not, by that logic, be unjust. Alexander found some comfort in this. He probably should not have. What had actually happened at Maracanda beneath the wine and the grief, this was a confrontation between two irreconcilable versions of what Alexander was supposed to be. Cleitus represented the Macedonian soldiers who had given him everything he had, men who had marched from Europe to the edge of India, who had followed a king they believed in, who expected in return to be acknowledged as the foundation of everything he had built. Alexander was now a man who wore Persian robes, kept Persian court ceremony, and was allowing himself to be called the son of a god. Those two things could not coexist in the same room indefinitely. At Maracanda, in the autumn of 328 BC, they ran out of space. The men who had watched it happen went back to their tents and said very little. Cleitus had said everything that many of them thought, and it had killed him. The lesson was not complicated. The free speech that had once existed between a Macedonian king and his companions, the blunt soldier's language of men who ate together and fought together and told each other the truth, was gone. What replaced it was something more formal, more careful, and much more lonely. Alexander would spend the rest of his life surrounded by men who had learned, on the night of Cleitus's death, exactly how much truth the king could bear. By 327 BC, Alexander had been governing the Persian Empire for 3 years, and he had spent those years learning what governing it actually required. The Persian court ran on ritual, on visible codified displays of hierarchy that told every person in the room exactly where they stood in relation to the king. One of the most fundamental of these rituals was Proskynesis, a gesture of obeisance performed before the king, ranging from a deep bow to full prostration, depending on the rank of the person performing it. Every Persian noble did it, every satrap did it. It was simply the grammar of the court, the way power announced itself in a room. For a man who was simultaneously trying to rule Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, Bactrians, and Sogdians under a single administration, some version of common court ceremony was not an indulgence. It was a practical necessity. The Macedonians and Greeks understood Proskynesis differently. For them, it was not a gesture of political deference. It was an act of worship, something performed before the statues of gods, not before the person of a man. To prostrate yourself before Alexander was to declare him a god. Some of the Macedonian officers had been watching him move in that direction for years. The Siwah oracle, the ram's horns beginning to appear on his coinage, the Persian robes, the increasingly elaborate court ceremony. Proskynesis was the line they would not cross, and Alexander, testing where that line was, arranged a banquet at Bactria, where a golden cup was passed from guest to guest. Each man drank, performed the obeisance, and received a kiss from Alexander in return. It moved around the room without incident until it reached Callisthenes. Callisthenes was Alexander's official historian, the man Aristotle had recommended for the campaign, the man whose written account of the conquest was the version reaching the Greek world back home. He had spent years making Alexander sound like Achilles. He drank from the cup, rose, and walked toward Alexander to receive the kiss, without having performed the obeisance. A companion standing nearby pointed this out. Alexander refused the kiss. Callisthenes walked away and said, loudly enough for those around him to hear, that he would leave one kiss the poor. The room absorbed the moment in silence. Alexander let it pass. He did not abandon the Proskynesis experiment immediately, but Callisthenes had given every Macedonian in the room permission to refuse it, and after that, the experiment was effectively over. Alexander backed down. He was too politically intelligent to force the issue when the resistance was unified, and he understood that the army's loyalty was the one thing that could not be replaced. But backing down did not mean forgetting. Callisthenes had publicly humiliated him in front of the court, when he had allied himself with the Macedonian officer's resentment, and had used his position as the keeper of Alexander's official legacy as a weapon. The historian who was supposed to be writing Alexander's greatness into permanence had instead become the spokesman for everything Alexander's own men found wrong with him. That was a debt Alexander filed away carefully and waited to collect. What the Proskynesis episode exposed, more than anything else, was the fundamental contradiction at the heart of Alexander's empire. He was trying to be two kings simultaneously. The Macedonian warrior king, who ate with his men, hunted with them, and led from the front, and the Persian god king whose court was built on hierarchy, deference, and the visible performance of absolute power. Those two roles required opposite things from the people around him. The Macedonians needed to feel that he was still one of them. The Persians needed to see that he was above everyone. For years, Alexander had managed the contradiction by moving between the two worlds, depending on context. Proskynesis was the moment when the two worlds were in the same room at the same time, and they could not both be satisfied. The royal pages were the sons of Macedonia's nobility, boys between 14 and 18 who served at court as a mark of their family's loyalty and as a path into the officer class of the army. They attended Alexander personally, brought his horses, guarded his tent at night, and rotated through the watch on his sleeping quarters. They were close to him in the way that servants are close to powerful men, present at intimate moments. privy to the small humiliations and rages that public life conceals, and entirely without power to act on what they knew. In the spring of 327 BC, one of them decided he had seen enough. Hermolaus was the son of a senior Macedonian officer. During a hunt, he had killed a boar that charged at Alexander before the king had a chance to strike. It was a breach of protocol. The king was entitled to the first kill, and Alexander, in front of the other pages, had Hermolaus publicly flogged and stripped of his horse. The punishment was technically within the rules of the court. It was also the kind of act that a man of high spirit, young and proud, and already living in the shadow of a king whose temper had killed Cleitus the Black less than a year before, could not absorb without consequence. Hermolaus recruited 5 other pages into a plot to kill Alexander in his sleep, on a night when the conspirators controlled the watch rotation. On the chosen night, Alexander stayed up drinking until dawn, kept late, one ancient account claims, by a Syrian prophetess who warned him not to retire. The conspirators, losing their nerve as the night went on, abandoned the attempt. The following day, one of the pages involved in the plot told a friend outside the conspiracy, who told his brother, who went to Alexander's bodyguard Ptolemy before the sun had properly risen. By morning, all 6 conspirators were under arrest. Under torture, they named their own guilt and each other's, and did not name Callisthenes. Alexander had their names written in a letter to his commanders confirming that the pages had acted alone. And then he arrested Callisthenes anyway. The connection between Callisthenes and the pages was that he was their tutor. He had taught Hermolaus and the others philosophy, rhetoric, and the history of Greek freedom, subjects that, in the overheated atmosphere of Alexander's court in 327 BC, looked different in retrospect than they had when the lessons were given. There was no evidence that Callisthenes had known about the plot. There was ample reason, from Alexander's perspective, to remove him regardless. The Proskynesis humiliation was less than a year old. Callisthenes had made himself the voice of Macedonian resistance and used his pen to shape how the Greek world understood the campaign. A man with that combination of access, influence, and opposition was dangerous, whether or not he had conspired. Callisthenes was arrested, chained, and carried in a cage with the army as it moved east into India. The accounts of his death differ. Some say he was executed before Alexander reached the Indus. Some say he died of disease in his chains months later. No replacement historian was appointed. The official written record of Alexander's campaign stopped in 327 BC, the year Callisthenes was silenced, and was never resumed. Everything that happened after, India, the mutiny, the desert march, the return, would be reconstructed from the memoirs of generals and the accounts of men who had not been there. Alexander had gone to war with a historian whose job it was to tell his story. He ended the campaign with no one filling that role. The story he left behind was the one his enemies, his survivors, and the passage of centuries would write for him. In the summer of 327 BC, Alexander divided his army into 2 columns and led the northern column himself through the passes of the Hindu Kush into the river valleys of what is now northern Pakistan. The mountains were everything the Iranian plateau was not: steep, forested, threaded with fast rivers that ran cold even in summer, inhabited by tribes who had no interest in becoming part of any empire, and who had been fighting intruders in these passes since before anyone had written down the name of their people. The Persian Empire had claimed these territories on paper. In practice, every valley had to be taken separately, by force, at cost. The Vespasians were the first. They burned their villages ahead of the Macedonian advance and fled to the high ground, and Alexander pursued them into the hills with his light infantry and cavalry, and taking their strongholds one by one. In the fighting, he took a dart through the shoulder. He kept moving. The Guerrillas razed their own towns rather than let them fall intact, and were defeated in the open. Then came the Assassinians of the Swat Valley. a kingdom large enough to field an army of 30,000 infantry, 30 elephants, and a force of professional mercenaries. Their capital was Massaga, a fortified city on high ground, and its defense fell first to the king, and then, when the king was killed in the fighting, to his mother. The siege took several days. Alexander was wounded in the ankle during the assault. The city fell. And the survivors of the mercenary garrison, several thousand men who had negotiated terms of surrender, were surrounded at night and killed to a man when Alexander decided their loyalty could not be trusted. From Massaga, he pushed to Arnos, a massive flat-topped rock fortress above the upper Indus, considered impregnable, which legend said Heracles himself had failed to capture. Alexander spent weeks engineering an approach across a ravine, filling it with timber and earth until his siege equipment could reach the walls. The fortress fell in the winter of 327 to 326 BC. His biographer, Robin Lane Fox, called it the climax of Alexander's career as a besieger. Alexander would have appreciated the comparison to Heracles. He would have appreciated it rather too much. East of Aornos, across the Indus, lay the kingdom of Taxila, a wealthy, urbanized city-state whose ruler Ambi had already sent envoys to Alexander and offered alliance. Ambi's calculation was straightforward. His neighbor and rival Porus, king of the Pauravas, was the greater threat, and a Macedonian army at his back was a more useful instrument than Macedonian gold. Alexander accepted the alliance and accepted the gifts that came with it: 200 silver talents, 3,000 cattle, 10,000 sheep, and 30 war elephants. He then received Porus's response to his demand for submission. Porus sent back word that he would meet Alexander at the Hydaspes River. He would be waiting with his army. The men who made the crossing into India were not the same men who had crossed the Hellespont 7 years earlier. They were harder, leaner, and more deeply competent in the mechanics of war than any soldiers alive. They had crossed deserts, mountains, and every kind of river, fought every kind of enemy, and survived every kind of climate from the Libyan coast to the Afghan steppe. They had also been away from home for 7 years, and the further east they marched, the less any of them could clearly picture what home looked like. They were following a king who was also not quite the same man who had left Macedonia. He wore Persian dress now, kept Persian ceremony, had a Bactrian wife, and was pressing toward a horizon that kept receding. They followed him because they had always followed him, because the habit of victory was powerful, and because turning back required a kind of courage that was harder than charging a Persian line. For now, they kept moving east. And the Hydaspes River in the spring of 326 BC was not the river it was in winter. The monsoon rains and the snowmelt from the Himalayas had swollen it to more than a mile wide in places, fast and brown and deep, with a current that would pull a horse off its feet. Porus had positioned his army on the eastern bank, thousands of infantry, cavalry, chariots, and between 85 and 200 war elephants, depending on which ancient source one chooses to believe. The elephants were the point. Horses would not go near them. Alexander's companion cavalry, the instrument that had broken the Persian line at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, was useless against an army screened by elephants. Porus knew this, and he was waiting for Alexander to try to cross into his preparation. For weeks, Alexander played a game of deception. He moved his cavalry up and down the western bank at night, making noise, simulating crossing preparations, forcing Porus's army to shadow him through the dark and the rain. When the Indian king's troops had been doing this long enough that their responses were slowing, when the false alarms had become routine, Alexander led a column of his best cavalry and infantry upstream in the dark during a violent thunderstorm 17 miles from the main camp to a crossing point screened from Porus's scouts by a bend in the river and a wooded island. The storm covered the sound of the boats. By the time Porus understood what was happening, Alexander's forces were already on the eastern bank. Porus sent his son with a cavalry force to pin Alexander at the river while the main army moved up. The son was killed and his force broken before the main battle began. Porus then advanced with the full weight of his army, the elephants forming a wall in front of the infantry, the cavalry and chariots on the wings. Alexander kept his cavalry away from the elephants entirely, attacking the Indian horse on both flanks, while his infantry engaged the elephant line from the front. The sarissas, 18 feet long, could reach the animals before their trunks could grab the men holding them. The archers targeted the mahouts, the drivers seated on the elephants' necks. Cleitus, who had been left on the western bank with the rest of the army, crossed the river as the battle developed and hit the Indian rear. The elephants were the battle's decisive element, and not in the way Porus had intended. Wounded and maddened, losing their drivers, and as they turned on their own men as readily as on the Macedonians, enormous, uncontrollable, crushing whatever was beneath them. The Indian infantry broke around the animals, and the Macedonian phalanx pushed through the chaos. The Macedonian casualties were the heaviest of any battle in the campaign, around 1,000 men by ancient estimates, against perhaps 12,000 Indian dead. Alexander's own horse, Bucephalus, died either during or shortly after the battle. The horse he had tamed as a boy in Macedonia that had carried him from the Hellespont to the Punjab. Alexander founded a city on the river and named it Bucephala. Porus was captured after the fighting and brought before Alexander. He was a very large man. Ancient accounts describe him as standing nearly 7 feet tall, and he came forward with the bearing of someone who had done nothing he was ashamed of. Alexander asked him how he wanted to be treated. Porus said, "As a king treats a king." Alexander gave him back his kingdom, made him a satrap, and eventually added territory to his rule. It was one of the most magnanimous things Alexander ever did, and it happened at the moment when the campaign was about to break. The men who had followed him all this way were looking east at reports of even larger armies and another river and another kingdom beyond that, and their feet were no longer moving with the same willingness they once had. Alexander gave Porus his kingdom back, named a city for his horse, and pointed east again. The army looked at the horizon. The horizon kept going. East of Porus's kingdom, the reports coming in were not encouraging. The Nanda Empire of Magadha, based in the Ganges Valley, commanded an army that Greek sources placed at 200,000 infantry, 80,000 cavalry, 8,000 war chariots, and 6,000 war elephants, numbers that were almost certainly exaggerated, but not invented. The men who had survived the Hydaspes were a force of perhaps 20,000 Indians with 90 elephants had cost them 1,000 dead, heard those numbers, and did their arithmetic. The monsoon had been falling for weeks. Their equipment was rotting. Many had not seen Macedonia in 8 years. At the Hyphasis River, the modern Bes, in what is now the Punjab, the army stopped. Alexander called an assembly and addressed his officers. He spoke at length about the glory still within reach, the edge of the world only a little further east, the ocean that the Greek geographers said bounded India just beyond the Ganges. He reminded them of everything they had already done together and everything they still stood to gain. The speech, as reconstructed by Arrian from officers' memoirs decades later, is the oration of a man accustomed to talking men into the impossible. This time, the assembly listened in silence. Nobody cheered. Nobody volunteered. When Alexander finished, the silence continued. He had never faced a room like it in his life. Conus spoke for the army. He was a senior general, son-in-law of the executed Parmenion, a man who had served Alexander through every campaign since the Hellespont. And he chose his words with precision. He praised everything Alexander had achieved. He acknowledged the king's courage without qualification. Then he said plainly that the men longed to see their parents, their wives, their children, and their homeland again. They had given everything. They had nothing left. He asked Alexander for the first time to turn back. When Conus sat down, the other officers wept, not with grief, with relief that someone had finally said it. Alexander dismissed the assembly in fury and withdrew to his tent. He refused to admit anyone for 3 days, waiting for the army to change its mind, perhaps hoping that the habit of following him would overcome the exhaustion of 8 years. It did not. On the 3rd day, having consulted the omens and found them unfavorable for further advance, a determination that satisfied the army's need for a divine sanction that nobody had to acknowledge was convenient, he announced that they would turn back. The army's response was immediate and complete. Men wept in the camp, came to his tent, and called his name, blessing him for finally listening. The sound of an army weeping with joy because its king had agreed to go home was something Alexander had never heard before and would not hear again. He built 12 great altars on the eastern bank of the Hyphasis, one for each of the Olympian gods, to mark the furthest point his army had reached and to signal to whatever lay beyond that the gods had decreed this was far enough. Then he turned the army south, following the Indus toward the sea. Conus died of illness a few weeks later, quickly enough to generate speculation in antiquity, though there is no evidence of foul play and the sources treat it as natural. Alexander mourned him publicly and gave him a magnificent funeral. Whatever the king felt privately about the man who had spoken for his army at the Hyphasis, he took it to his grave. The march south along the Indus was not the quiet withdrawal of a returning army. Alexander fought almost continuously as he went, reducing the tribes of the river valley that had not submitted to his authority on the way down. The Mali, in the territory near modern Multan, resisted in force, withdrawing their population and valuables into their fortified cities and combining with their traditional enemies, the Oxydracians, against a common threat. As Alexander divided his army into columns that converged from multiple directions simultaneously to prevent the tribes from reinforcing each other. The speed of the campaign, including a forced march across open desert that covered the ground in a single night, arriving before dawn while the Mali were still outside their city walls, broke the resistance before it could organize. The towns that fell were destroyed. The people inside them were killed. At one of the Malian citadels, the sources do not agree on which one, Alexander scaled the wall ahead of his men with only 3 companions, dropped inside the fortification before the rest of his troops could follow, and fought alone until 2 of his companions were down and the garrison surrounded him. He took an arrow through the chest. The arrowhead pierced his lung, and he collapsed on his shield. His men came over the wall when they saw him fall and massacred every person inside the citadel. Alexander was carried from the city on his shield, unconscious, bleeding from the mouth. The army outside, who had not seen him, heard the rumor that he was dead and stood in silence. When he was lifted onto a boat to be transported downstream for treatment, still alive, he raised his hand to the men on the bank. They wept and shouted and reached toward him across the water. The arrow was removed by his surgeon, Critodemos of Kos. He recovered over the following weeks, but the wound came close. Closer than the Granicus. Closer than anything before it. From the coast of the Indian Ocean, Alexander divided the return. Nearchus, a Cretan officer with naval experience, took the fleet west along the shore of the Persian Gulf. Unknown waters, never charted by Greeks, with no established supply points along the coast. It was genuinely one of the great voyages of the ancient world, and it succeeded. The army Alexander led himself took a different route, west across the Gedrosian desert, through the territory of what is now southern Pakistan and the Iranian province of Balochistan. Alexander knew that Cyrus the Great had tried to cross Gedrosia with an army and lost almost everyone. He knew that the semi-legendary Queen Semiramis was said to have emerged with 20 survivors. He chose the route anyway. The Gedrosian march lasted 60 days. The desert offered cracked salt flats, shifting dunes, and rock that reflected heat at temperatures reaching 45 degrees Celsius by day, with freezing winds at night. Water was almost entirely absent. The guides lost the road in the sandstorms and had to be led back to the coast to reorient before returning inland. At one point, a flash flood roared through the dry riverbed, where the baggage train was camped at night, drowning most of the women, children, and servants who had accompanied the army from India. The pack animals collapsed and died. Men who fell behind were not found again. At least 12,000 soldiers died in the crossing. Some ancient estimates run much higher. In addition to uncounted thousands of camp followers and non-combatants. Ancient sources record that more men died in the Gedrosian desert than in any battle Alexander had ever fought. Why Alexander chose the desert route has never been satisfactorily explained. He stated, according to Granicus, that he wanted to succeed where Cyrus and Semiramis had failed, to demonstrate that what the greatest rulers of the ancient world could not accomplish, he could. Some later historians have suggested that the route was chosen partly to punish his men for the mutiny at the Hyphasis. The evidence for that interpretation is circumstantial and contested. What the sources do not contest is that the route was unnecessary. An easier road through the interior existed and was known, and Cleitus had already been sent along it with the elephants and the wounded. Alexander took the killing route with the main army. He walked the same ground his men walked, drank when they drank, and went without when they went without, and several times in the march poured out water that was brought to him personally because there was not enough for everyone. Yet the army emerged from the desert into Carmania at the end of 325 BC. Alexander dressed as Dionysus and ordered a week of celebration. The men who were still alive drank and did not ask why. On the road back from Carmania to Susa in early 324 BC, Alexander found out what his empire had been doing in his absence. He had been gone for 3 years. 3 years in Bactria, then India, then the desert. And in that time, a number of his satraps and military governors had assumed, with some justification, that he would not return. They had levied illegal taxes, seized temple treasuries, raised their own private armies, and in several cases executed people without authority. Alexander dealt with them with the same speed he brought to everything else. Several governors were arrested and executed on the road. Hyphasis, the imperial treasurer whom Alexander had trusted since boyhood, had stolen an enormous sum from the royal treasury, fled to Greece with 6,000 mercenaries and 5,000 talents, and tried to buy Athenian protection. He was eventually murdered by his own associates in Crete. The empire that had seemed like a structure when Alexander was at its center revealed itself in his absence as something much more fragile. A set of personal loyalties to a man, held together by the expectation that he was watching. At Susa, Alexander paid off his soldiers' personal debts, a figure the sources put at approximately 20,000 talents. He announced it without conditions and without asking what the money had been spent on. He then organized the mass marriage at the palace. 92 Macedonian officers and companions married Persian and Median noblewomen in a ceremony conducted according to Persian custom. Alexander himself married Statira, the eldest daughter of Darius III, the woman who had been his captive since Issus a decade earlier, and also Persepolis, daughter of Artaxerxes III. He gave Hephaestion the hand of Darius, Statira's sister, so that their children would be cousins to his own. The ceremony was elaborate, careful, and entirely Persian in its form. Chairs were placed in order of precedence. The brides entered and sat beside their grooms. The king kissed his wife first, then every other bridegroom kissed theirs. The marriages were the most visible expression of what Alexander had been moving toward for years. A fused ruling class. Macedonian and Persian blood combined in a single generation of children who would inherit an empire that belonged to both. It was a coherent vision, It was also a vision that his officers received with varying degrees of enthusiasm. They took their brides. Most of them, as the evidence suggests, also kept the Persian women they had acquired informally over years of campaigning. Whether they believed in Alexander's project of fusion or simply understood that refusing the king's arrangements was not an available option is a question the sources cannot fully answer. The 30,000 young Persians who arrived at Susa that same year made the project harder to dismiss as ceremony. They were called the successors. Young men recruited from across the eastern provinces, trained for years in the Macedonian art of war. You drilled in the phalanx formation, equipped with the sarissa, dressed in Macedonian style, and capable of performing every maneuver the Macedonian infantry could perform. Alexander reviewed them and called them magnificent. The Macedonian veterans watching the review did not use that word. These young Persians had been raised specifically to replace them, and everyone understood it, including Alexander. He also announced that the oldest Macedonian veterans, men who had been on campaign since Philip's time, men who had fought at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela, would be sent home to Macedonia with full honors, generous bonuses, and the gratitude of their king. He framed it as a reward. His men heard it as a dismissal. The men who had made him were being retired. The men who would carry his empire forward were 30,000 Persians who had never crossed the Hellespont. The tension that had been building since Persepolis, through the murder of Cleitus, through Proskynesis, through the years in Bactria, was about to reach its last and most explicit form. The army marched north to Opis, and the reckoning came there. At Opis, on the Tigris, in the summer of 324 BC, Alexander assembled the Macedonian troops and confirmed what he had said at Susa. The veterans unfit for further service were going home. The men shouted him down before he had finished. They told him to send them all home, him and his father Ammon with them, since he had no further use for Macedonians. There was a quality of exhaustion in the insult, 10 years of accumulating grievance compressed into a single shout. Thus Alexander came down from the platform, ordered his bodyguard to identify the loudest voices in the crowd, and had 13 of them arrested and executed on the spot. Then he went back inside his tent and closed the door. For 2 days he refused to come out or receive anyone. On the third day he summoned the Persian commanders and began distributing to them the titles and honors that had previously belonged to Macedonians. Persian officers were appointed to command the elite units. Persian cavalry were incorporated into the companion squadrons. The title of kinsman, the highest mark of personal distinction Alexander could bestow, was given to Persian nobles. The Macedonian troops outside could hear what was happening. They gathered at the tent entrance, threw down their weapons in the gesture of supplication, and stood calling his name. They would not move. They remained at the door through the night and into the following day. Alexander came out and looked at them. A senior cavalry commander named Callisthenes spoke for the army. He said that what wounded the Macedonians was that Alexander had made Persians his kinsmen, that Persians were permitted to kiss the king, while no Macedonian had been granted that honor. Alexander replied immediately. All of them were his kinsmen, every one of them. The title was theirs from that moment. Callisthenes stepped forward and kissed the king. The men around him pressed forward and kissed him too, weeping. They picked up their weapons and went back to camp singing. Alexander held a banquet of reconciliation attended by 9,000 men, Macedonians and Persians seated together, drinking from the same cups, while Alexander prayed publicly for harmony between the peoples and for the Macedonians and Persians to share the governance of the empire as partners. It was the most explicit statement he had ever made of what he had been building toward since Persepolis, and he made it to 9,000 people who had just tried to abandon him. The prayer was genuine. The gathering was genuine, and the 10,000 Macedonian veterans were sent home to Macedonia with a talent each, their back pay, and orders to breed sons who would become soldiers. They left before winter. What remained after Opus was an army that was genuinely new, Macedonian officers commanding Persian infantry and cavalry alongside the veterans who had stayed. A force that could no longer be called exclusively Greek in any meaningful sense. Alexander had the instrument he needed for whatever came next. He had Arabia in mind, and beyond Arabia the Western Mediterranean, and beyond that, whatever lay at the edge of the ocean. His men had stopped asking where it would end. They had learned at Opus that the answer to that question was when he said so. The empire now moved on his will alone. There was nothing left to counterbalance it. In the autumn of 324 BC, the army was at Ecbatana for a festival. Games, theater, 3,000 performers brought from Greece, the kind of celebration Alexander had always used to mark a pause between campaigns. He and Hephaestion had been together since boyhood, had served on every campaign since the Hellespont, had laid garlands on the tomb of Achilles and Patroclus at Troy a decade earlier, and made the comparison explicit. Hephaestion was the one person in Alexander's life who had never wanted anything from him except his company. He commanded the companion cavalry. He had married Drypetis, Darius's younger daughter, at Susa, so that his children and Alexander's would share royal blood on both sides. He was 32 years old, in good health, and at the height of his power. He fell ill with a fever during the festival. His physician Glaucius put him on a strict diet and monitored him daily. After 7 days, the fever seemed to ease. Hephaestion was hungry, and his doctor had gone to the theater. He ate a large breakfast, a boiled chicken, a cooler of chilled wine, and relapsed within hours. Alexander was summoned from the games. He arrived at his friend's bedside to find Hephaestion already dead. He had not been there. He flung himself on the body and lay there the rest of the day. His companions eventually dragged him away by force. He had the physician Glaucius executed. He ordered the battlements stripped from the cities of the surrounding region, the manes and tails of all the horses and mules shorn as a sign of mourning, flutes and music silenced throughout the camp. He petitioned the Oracle at Siwah to grant Hephaestion divine status. The Oracle allowed him to be honored as a divine hero, not a god. Alexander declared that sufficient and ordered shrines built throughout the empire. He planned a funeral pyre at Babylon that was to cost 10,000 talents, more than the annual tribute of a province, built in 7 ascending stages decorated with prows of warships, eagles, and golden lions. It was designed by the architect Stasicrates to exceed in scale anything the ancient world had seen. He did not eat for 3 days. He lay on the ground without speaking. When he rose, he launched a winter campaign against the Kasaans, a mountain people in the hills of Luristan, who had resisted Persian rule for generations and raided the lowlands at will. He swept through their territory and destroyed them with a speed that left no possibility of resistance. Ancient sources called it a human hunt. Plutarch said plainly that it was an offering to the shade of Hephaestion. It is the most revealing thing Alexander did after his friend died. Unable to grieve quietly, unable to direct his grief inward, he converted it into action, into destruction, into the only language he had ever fully mastered. Hephaestion's cavalry regiment was not reassigned, and Alexander left it under his friend's name, Hephaestion's regiment, and it marched under that designation for the rest of the campaign. The companion cavalry that had broken the Persian line at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela would carry a dead man's name on its standard until Alexander himself was gone. The decision was not administrative. It was the act of a man who had been losing pieces of himself since Persepolis, since Cleitus, since the murders and the mutinies and the desert, and had now lost the last piece he could not replace. He returned to Babylon to plan the Arabian campaign. He had never been more alone. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander entered Babylon. The Chaldean priests warned him not to enter the city from the west. Their god Bel had foretold disaster if he did. He tried to approach from the east but was turned back by marshland and had to enter from the west after all. He dismissed the omen and set to work. Ambassadors arrived from across the known world and beyond. Libyans, Etruscans, Lucanians, Iberians, men from the edges of the Mediterranean who had come to acknowledge the king, whose name had reached them across distances he had never traveled. He received them in state, planned harbor improvements on the Euphrates, ordered a fleet assembled for the Arabian coast, and spent his evenings drinking heavily with his officers. In late May, he attended a banquet given by a naval officer named Nearchus, then continued drinking the following day at a dinner hosted by a Thessalian companion named Medius. He drank through the night. Toward morning, he felt pain, described in the sources as a blow between the shoulder blades, sharp and sudden, and had to be helped from the room. A fever followed. He continued working the next day despite it, conducting briefings with his officers, going through his plans for Arabia. The fever did not break. He moved to the palace gardens where the air was cooler and continued his briefings from there. His condition worsened across the following week. By the 9th day, he could barely speak. His generals, alarmed by the rumors spreading through the camp that the king was already dead, asked him what would happen to the empire. He said, "To the strongest." Some sources say he passed his signet ring to Perdiccas, one of his senior commanders, as a gesture of nominal succession. He may have said both things. He was beyond the point where anything he said could be acted upon. His soldiers heard the rumor that he was dying and came to his door in such numbers that the guards could not hold them. Alexander ordered them let through. The men filed past his bed for hours, thousands of them. The veterans of India and Bactria and the desert, men who had followed him for 10 years and more. He could not speak. He raised his hand as each man passed. He died on the evening of June 10th, 323 BC, in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He was 32 years old. His body did not begin to decompose for 6 days, a fact that astonished his physicians and was taken by everyone present as a sign of the divine status he had always claimed. Modern medicine offers other explanations. Typhoid fever, malaria, and an autoimmune condition called Guillain-Barré syndrome have all been proposed, and none has been conclusively ruled out. Whether he was poisoned remains genuinely uncertain. The empire he left behind had no designated successor, no constitutional arrangement for transfer of power, and no structure capable of functioning without the man who had built it. His generals were already calculating before the body was cold. He had founded more than 20 cities bearing his name, from Egypt to the edges of India. He had crossed 3 continents in 11 years without losing a battle. He had never appointed an heir, never written down a plan for what came after him, never seems to have seriously imagined a future in which he was not present. Would the man who had modeled himself on Achilles, who had chosen the short, brilliant life over the long, obscure one, had gotten exactly what he chose? The world had the name forever. The empire lasted about as long as it took his body to reach its tomb. In the room where Alexander died in Babylon in June of 323 BC, his generals gathered and faced a problem that had no solution. He had left no will, no designated heir, and no constitutional mechanism for transfer of power. Roxana was pregnant, but the child had not yet been born, and its sex was unknown. His half-brother Aridaeus was in Babylon and was Macedonian through both parents, but he was intellectually disabled and incapable of governing. No, the men who had made themselves the most powerful force on earth stood in a palace in Mesopotamia and had no answer to the simplest question a kingdom can face. Who rules next? A compromise was arranged within days. Aridaeus was crowned as Philip III. When Roxana gave birth to a son weeks later, the infant became Alexander IV, joint king with his uncle. Perdiccas, the senior cavalry commander to whom Alexander had almost certainly passed his ring, assumed the regency. The generals who had served together for a decade, men who had eaten from the same table and bled on the same ground, divided the provinces between themselves as satrapies and began positioning. Roxana, with Perdiccas's approval and her own calculation, had Alexander's Persian wife Statera and her sister Drypetis murdered, and their bodies thrown down a well. The women Alexander had married at Susa to bind his two worlds together were dead within weeks of his funeral. The wars that followed lasted 40 years and consumed almost everyone who had known Alexander personally. Perdiccas was murdered by his own officers during a failed invasion of Egypt in 321 BC after his troops were lost crossing the Nile. Antipater, the one general with enough prestige to hold the peace, died of old age in 319 BC, and the fragmentation accelerated. Olympias, Alexander's mother, invaded Macedonia, had Philip III killed, and forced his wife Eurydice to commit suicide. Then was herself captured and executed by Cassander, who then murdered Roxana and the young Alexander IV in 310 BC and kept the death secret for years, continuing to issue decrees in the dead boy's name while he consolidated his own power. The Argead dynasty that had ruled Macedonia for centuries ended in a locked room. Ptolemy stole Alexander's body. It was being escorted back to Macedonia for burial in the royal tombs at Aegae when Ptolemy intercepted the funeral cortege in Syria and rerouted it to Egypt, first to Memphis, then eventually to Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded on the Egyptian coast and never seen completed. A magnificent mausoleum was built. For generations, the Ptolemaic kings of Egypt and later Roman emperors made pilgrimage to the tomb. Julius Caesar wept there. Augustus accidentally broke the nose from the mummified body while leaning in to pay his respects. By late antiquity, the location of the tomb had been lost, and it has not been found since. The body of the man who conquered the world to make himself immortal lies somewhere under a modern city, unknown. At the Battle of Ipsus, in 301 BC, the last serious attempt to reunite the empire under a single ruler was defeated. Antigonus, who had come closest to assembling enough territory to reconstruct something resembling Alexander's dominion, was killed on the battlefield at the age of 81, still fighting. His death ended the dream of reunification. What remained were three major successor kingdoms: the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia. Greek in language, Macedonian in ruling class, local in everything else, and permanently at war with each other. The empire Alexander had held together by the force of his own will and name had required exactly that to exist. The moment he was gone, it began to die. It took 40 years to finish. The Hellenistic world that Alexander's campaign produced was not the world he intended. He had imagined a fused empire, Macedonian and Persian, Greek and Eastern, governed by a single ruling class of mixed blood loyal to a single throne. What emerged instead was a scattering of Greek-speaking kingdoms across the territory of the old Persian Empire, each one ruled by a Macedonian dynasty that kept the forms of Greek culture while governing populations that were Egyptian, Syrian, Babylonian, Bactrian, and everything else. The fusion Alexander dreamed of never quite happened at the top. It happened everywhere else. In the cities, in the markets, in the temples, in the workshops where sculptors began combining Greek forms with Egyptian and Persian subjects, something genuinely new grew out of the collision he had engineered. Greek became the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean world, not the literary Greek of Athens, but a simplified, practical version called Koine, the language of trade and administration, and eventually of the New Testament. A Syrian merchant in Antioch, and a Jewish scholar in Alexandria, and a Bactrian official in the eastern provinces all wrote and read in the same tongue. That shared language held a network of ideas together across distances that no political structure could span, and it outlasted every kingdom that Alexander's generals founded. The Greek language as a living vehicle of thought survived in the Byzantine Empire until 1453 AD, 17 centuries after Alexander died in Babylon. In Alexandria became what Alexander had designed it to be, and then became much more. Within a century of its founding, it was the largest city in the world, larger than Carthage, second only eventually to Rome. Its library accumulated the manuscripts of every culture it could reach: Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Jewish, and attracted the greatest minds of the age. Euclid worked out the foundations of geometry there. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth there, accurately, using 2 sticks, and the angle of the sun's shadow, around 240 BC. Archimedes studied there before returning to Syracuse. The city Alexander marked out with grain from his soldiers' rations became one of the great intellectual engines of the ancient world. And it did so precisely because it sat at the intersection of every culture his campaign had thrown together. The question the whole story eventually forces is whether it was worth it. The cost is not difficult to calculate. Tens of thousands dead in the battles, unknown numbers in the sieges and the desert march and the guerrilla wars of Bactria, the destruction of Thebes, the massacre at Tyre, the burning of Persepolis, the execution of Philotas and the murder of Parmenion, the killing of Cleitus, the silencing of Callisthenes, the murder of Roxana and Alexander's son, the 40 years of war that followed his death and consumed the men and the families and the countries that had built the empire. The Macedonian army that had followed him from Europe in 334 BC was largely gone before he died. The empire was gone before the century ended, and the man himself was gone at 32. What remained was the world he had changed without meaning to, not the empire which died with him, but the connections, the language, the cities, the ideas, the new forms of art and thought and science that grew in the space where 2 civilizations had been forced into each other at spear point. Koine Greek became the vessel that carried philosophy east and religion west. Alexandria became the place where human knowledge was assembled in one building for the first time. The Hellenistic fusion he created in violence persisted in culture for centuries after the violence was forgotten. Whether a man who destroyed so much to build something he never saw completed deserves the name history gave him is a question each generation answers for itself. He was given the name Great by people who had never met him, who knew only the scale of what he had done and not the cost of doing it. The people who had met him, the ones who survived, called him other things.